When approaching the translation of a poem, when a reading begins to evolve and shape itself nebulously into a new incarnation, I often feel the need to say a sort of grace in that quiet moment of gathering before beginning the work. And I find myself turning and returning to these words of Paul Celan in a letter to René Char. I have always tried to understand you, to respond to you, to take your work like one takes a hand. And it was, of course, my hand that took yours, there where it was certain not to miss the encounter. To that in your work which did not, or not yet, open up to my comprehension, I responded with respect and by waiting. One can never pretend to comprehend completely. That would be disrespect in the face of the unknown that inhabits or comes to inhabit the poet. That would be to forget that poetry is something one breathes, that poetry breathes you in. From this first moment of impact between poem and translator, an infinity of trajectories grows, each forging ahead, opening its own path, paths that intersect, reverberate, resonate, and of which no two are identical, owing to the unique and discrete points of encounter occurring between the constellation of the poem and the texture of the self. It gives me great pleasure to have Jennifer Scappettone and Mary Jo Bang here today to discuss their personal encounters with the work of Amelia Rosselli and Dante and the divergent projects that ensued. Jennifer Scappettone is a poet, translator, and scholar, the author of the books of the poetry collection From Dame Quickly and of several chapbooks, including Thing Ode, Ode Oggettuale, translated into Italian in conversation with Marco Giovanale. She edited and translated Locomotrix, Selected Poetry and Prose of Amelia Rosselli, which won the Academy of American Poets Biennial Raisis de Palci Book Award. Killing the Moonlight, Modernism in Venice is forthcoming in 2013 from Columbia University Press. Mary Jo Bang is the author of 4 books of poems, including Louise in Love and The Eye Like a Strange Balloon. Individual poems have appeared in The New Yorker, Paris Review, Fence, Verse, Volt, 2 volumes of the Best American Poetry, and elsewhere. She's been the recipient of numerous awards, including a fellowship from the Guggenheim Foundation and a Hodder Award from Princeton University. She is on the permanent faculty at Washington University, where she is Associate Professor of English and Director of the Creative Writing Program. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you, Chloe, and thank you, Christina Davis and the Woodberry Library for inviting us here. And thank you to Jennifer, who's a real translator and who's letting me sit here next to her. And I say that because I don't speak Italian, and yet I've translated Dante's Inferno. And that was made possible because so many other people have translated Dante's Inferno. There are over 200 translations in English. So people often ask me what got me started on such a project, especially given that I don't speak Italian. And it happened that I read a found poem by the experimental poet Carolyn Bergvall. It's called Via, 47 Dante Variations. And what she did was to take all of the collections or all of the books of the Inferno that were shelved at the British Library in the year 2000, and she took the first 3 lines, the famous first 3 lines, in the middle of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood, the right path had been lost. And she arranged the poem on the page with the Italian, which is fairly simple, above it, and then arranged the 47 translations alphabetically. She also included the attribution, the translator, and the date of the translation. And this was collected in a book of her poems, and I was sitting one day, it was summer, which I always think is a dangerous time for academics because we have a lot of time, more time than usual, and so we can kind of begin strange projects. And I was reading this book, and I was struck by this poem where this very simple language, which is unambiguous in many ways, nobody translated it, no two people translated it the same way. And I was struck with both the problems that inferred and the kind of permission that clearly was granted by those words. And so as I finished reading, I thought, well, I wonder, now that we have all of these translations that are accurate, and some of which are literal, and some of which even maintain the original Italian word order, what if I began to play with it? How might I translate those first 3 lines? And so I did, and then I did it again. It was so much fun. And then I thought, okay, that's enough fun. How about the next 3 lines? And the translation I had on my bookshelf was one by Charles S. Singleton, and it was done in 1970. It's a literal prose translation, but slightly elevated in tone and contains some anachronisms and thou'st and canst. And so I did the next 3 lines based on Singleton's translation, and then the next 3. And then I realized, well, wait, for the first one, I had 47 Virgils, and now I only have 1. So I went to the library and I got 12 translations. And I decided that I would do the first canto, and that was, my intent was only to do the first canto. So over that summer, from time to time, I'd sit down and I'd do a few more tercets. And when I was finished, I'd had such a good time that I decided I would continue to do it. And even if it took me many years or my lifetime, this would be a game that I would play. Those initial translations or adaptations were very freewheeling, and when I look back on it now, they seem rather silly and almost parodic because, for instance, there was a Freud finger puppet in the poem, and there was language like "geez, Louise." So I reformed at some point, and one of the reasons was I discovered a dictionary, and an unabridged Italian English dictionary, and I became obsessed with getting it right. But at the same time, that original impulse to do something a little different, and what that had finally translated into was to put it in contemporary English. Because what I didn't like about many of the translations was that I was having to interrupt my reading process to rearrange the words into English order, or to bring the language down from that elevation of thou'st and canst. And I began to interrogate the whole idea of what is translation. If you're going to put something in your own language, should it be your own language at that moment? And I think I understood that these elevations were gestures to the fact that the poem was old, the poem was ancient, and so this was a translation choice to show the age of the poem. But it's not 1300 English by any means. And so in some ways, that didn't really, it wasn't convincing to me that to put it in 16th, 17th, or 18th century English was the way to show that it had been written in 1300. And wasn't it enough just to read and know that it had been written in 1300? So the aim became to put it into spoken English so that it would be readable for people who would be off-put by trying to tackle something like that, but also to capture the drama of it, because it really is a very novelistic and somewhat even filmic poem that has so much drama and has really well-developed characters. And if, as a reading strategy, you keep having to change the text as you read, you miss that opportunity. And my feeling as a poet was that was the opportunity that Dante had wanted us to have. So that was what I aimed to do, was to write a poem that would have that drama, have those characters, and feel like it was of this moment. So as I began to think how to make something of this moment, I also realized I wanted it to be a poem. And that meant it had to have certain sound patterns, because that's part of the aesthetic experience of poetry. So I didn't want it just to be flat, everyday prose. And so I would make decisions based on the rigor of trying to maintain my allegiance to the original, but to use sound patterning. And I know that the patterns that we use today as poets are primarily alliteration, assonance, and internal rhyme. So that was the decision that I made in terms of sound. And then I thought, well, one of the things Dante does is to incorporate a lot of text, and this was a medieval strategy of writing, was to take other works that had already been written and translate them into a more contemporary moment. So he's taking Ovid and Lucan and Virgil and incorporating those in his poem. And I thought, well, if I want it to come up to this moment, present day, spoken English, could I not incorporate the text of poets who have lived since? And would that not also be a way of making it modern? And then I thought, well, and what about all of those inclusions that he has that are the cultural icons of his moment? He has towers and races, and even tells us the prizes that were given for the race, a bolt of green cloth. And so I thought, well, also then, can I not incorporate some things that have to do with the present moment, that have the same kind of ability to construct a world? And it was also my desire to make the world of hell seem like it had continued to exist, so that if we found elements in hell of people who had lived on earth in our memories, wouldn't it seem that hell had continued? And I thought that that was in the interest of the homage that any translation is as well. So those were my principles: to make a poem, to incorporate present day moments when they embodied the past. So for instance, I didn't just want to throw in, a toaster oven and the King of Pop. There had to be a reason, and it had to match somehow what was in the original. So I'm going to read a little bit so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about, because it's one thing to describe what I've done, and it's another to hear it. I'm actually going to read you Canto 3, and perhaps all of you know what happens before that, but I'll just refresh your memory that our hero awakes in a dark wood, which allegorically is a spiritual awakening, and comes to himself and realizes he's lost the right way. So he tries to escape the wood and go up a hill, but he encounters a leopard. So he comes back down, he resolves again to go up, encounters a lion, comes back down, resolves again, and encounters a she-wolf. And at this time, he's really had it, and he's about to just give it all up. And he encounters the Roman poet Virgil, who then tells him, no, in order to get out of here, you really have to go deeper in, but I'll go with you, and I'll accompany you. So he says to him, as we go forward from here, it's best you stay behind me. I'll play the part of your guide. It's my plan to lead you through a place never ending, i.e. eternal, hell, where you'll hear the worst kind of wailing, see the ageless shades writhing in pain, sense their vain request for a second death. After that, you'll see those who are happy in the heat of the fire, because they hope at some point to pursue the path to purgatory and so achieve a Bible clerk's bliss. To those, if that's where you would go, up and farther up, you'll need another escort, one more honored than I. When I leave you, I'll leave you with her. The emperor on high says I can't enter his city. I wasn't obedient to his unbendable laws. He says I'm smudged by Adam's ink and so must live in limbo. He reigns in all parts of the empire. His city is there, so is his chair, poised at the edge of heaven. Happy are those he asks in. And I said to him, poet, I beg of you, by the God you never knew, help me out of this Denmark, which threatens to go from bad to worse. Lead me to where you just mentioned, so I can see the door of purgatory and meet St. Peter at the gate, and along the way see the dolorous souls who are designated damned. Then he set out, and I at his back. In Canto 2, he again begins to, he's resolved, but then he's having second thoughts, and Virgil ends up telling him how it is that these women in heaven have come to Virgil. Beatrice herself comes down to Limbo and begs Virgil to help Dante. And so he again convinces him to go. He says, Dante says, like those delicate flowers that bend their closed heads in the killing cold of night, and at daybreak look up and see the sun and open, so I felt myself come back to life, like a man on death row to whom it's been said, sorry, we made a terrible error, you're free now. I said how kind she was to help me, how gracious you were to respond so quickly to the truth of what she told you. You're very eloquent. After hearing you speak, I feel eager to go on. The initial scheme now seems feasible again. Let's go, since we're both of one mind. You'll be my tutor, docent, doctor. That's what I said to him. And then he moved, and I entered the dark wood, the crushing way. And at the beginning of Canto 3, again, it's kind of, that fades to black, and now we see Dante standing above a doorway and reading text, and this is the text. Welcome to the city of woe. Welcome to everlasting sadness. Welcome to the grave cave. Justice made the maker build it just like this, with primitive love and bricks of wisdom. If being is power, power created it, i.e., it is. Before this, there was nothing that wasn't eternal, and after, nothing but the eternal. You, who have no hope, enter here. These words, in soot and all in caps, as if by a hurried hand, were scrawled on the stone overhead above a creaking door. Sir, I said, this is harsh. He spoke like an expert nephew to a drunkard uncle. Now you need to leave behind your fear. Now you need to kill your cowardice. We're where I said we'd come to, the place where you'd see the wretched dead who have lost the aid of their intellect. He touched my hand as if to tell me all would be all right. Then we crossed over from where we'd been into the inner sanctum that houses hidden things. The starless air was echoing with countless sighs, horrific cries, extended loud laments. I was in tears as I listened. The angry accents, the strident utterances, the striking hands, the near-deafening chorus of 1,000,000 dolls' dark inner voices crying, "Mama, Mama, Mama," veered off walls and swirled around and around like sand in a storm becomes one with the wind that carries it. And I, circled by horror, said, "Sir, what am I hearing? Who are these people, so overcome by grief?" He said, "This is the inheritance of the contemptible, who did nothing wrong, but nothing right. They blend together with that band of vile angels who didn't rebel, but who also didn't stand with God, but only for themselves in selfishness. To preserve its beauty, heaven threw them out. Deepest hell doesn't want them, since the truly wicked would be able to gloat, 'We're worse, we're truly depraved.' I asked, what torments them? Why do they cry so loud and so unremittingly? He answered, I'll tell you quickly. They wish to die but cannot. Their blind lives are so empty, so without reprieve. They envy the nothing that an ending would be. They're not meant to be remembered. Mercy turns her back. Justice disdains them. They're not worth our attention. Look, and then let's go. I caught sight of a banner flitting about so restlessly and moving forward so fast it seemed unable to take a stand. It was followed by a sad and endless train of people racing after. Never had I dreamed death had so many sycophants. I saw some I recognized, and then the ghost of one who'd stood down when faced with doing good and chose instead to be a coward. I knew incontestably this scourge, these despicable cowards, were the enemies of both Jekyll and Hyde. They'd never lived and now would never die. Naked as the day they were born, bitter wasps and hornets covered them. Blood trickled between their tears. This sorry, sticky mixture dripped from their chins to their feet and into the mouths of maggots. Farther on, beyond these, I saw a crowd gathered on the bank of a wide river. I asked my guide, "Could you please tell me who these are and why they're waiting with such eagerness to board the boat I can barely make out in the distance?" He told me, "Hush, it will all be clear when we reach the bank of the miserable river Acheron." I was afraid I'd annoyed him by asking, so I stared at my feet and stayed quiet until we reached the river. Then, out of nowhere, there was an old man with white hair coming toward us in a boat, growling, "Give it up, you scum uncles. You'll never see the sky again. Like Red Rover, I'm taking you over to the other side, where you'll eat and drink perpetual darkness. Your naked asses will feel the furnace and the ice. And you, with the beating heart, step away from the dead." When I stood my ground, he said, "You can't get to where you're going from here. You need the dinghy marked P for purgatory. That one leaves from a different pier." Virgil said, "Karen, calm down." We were standing on the ramp. "It's been decided where decisions are made. His passport has a stamp. Now leave it alone." The hairy cheeks of the boatman, king of the river rats, went slack. His fire eyes flared, but he kept silent. The weary and naked ones, however, went ashen and gritted their teeth as soon as they heard his vicious speech. They cursed God, their parents, the human race, the moment of their conception, their father's seed, the space between their mother's legs, and the bed where they were made. Then they moved as one, as if conjoined, sobbing, all the while, along the evil shore that awaits any and all who fail to fear God, where demon Karen, his eyes like hollow furnaces filled with fire, herds them together with a nod or beckons with a bent finger, smacking the stragglers with his oar. Fall signals the tree to drop its leaves, and it does, one after the other, until the branch looks down and sees a blanket on the ground. Like that, Adam's wicked children leave the shore, one by one when summoned, the way trained birds come when called with a tin whistle. Then they go, over the murky water. Before the boat has landed on the far side, a new group is already huddled, naked, on the near. "Now," said my teacher, "to your earlier question. The ones you see here have died before making amends. They come from every known country. The reason they're so eager to cross the river is that the desire for divine justice prompts them. The very thing they fear is precisely what they want. The good never board the boat, so if Karen curses both your shoes and the dirt beneath your feet, perhaps you now know why." At that, the pitch-dark plain shook. Every aspect of that moment is burned into my brain. The cold sweat inside my clothes, the hot wind that rose off the ground wet with tears, the massive crimson camera flash that lit the night scene and turned us red. I lost it and dropped, like someone seized by narcoleptic sleep.
So I thought I'd start by reading one translation of the work of Amelia Rosselli without explanation, just so that you know what we're talking about, and also because any explanation that I can give of the challenge of rendering this work falls short, just as any sort of poetics tractate falls short of what poetry is, that is, if it's good. This is the first poem in Roselli's first collected book of poetry, which is called Variazioni Belliche, and it's from 1959. Roberto, Mum calls out, amusing herself in the white settee. I don't know which God wants from me, sober purposes tearing eternity, or the frank chortle of the puppet hanging from the balustrade. Balustrade, yes, balustrade, no. Oh, postpone your persuaded oration for a babbling deeply felt. Car, the parched and yellow leaves abduct the wind that beats them. Black vision, tree that tends toward that supreme force, farm, which I in fact retain, bleaches the earth below our feet instead. You are my lover girl if the sky darkens, and the shudder is yours in the eternal forest. Empty city, full city, city who blandishes pains for the mostly fanciful of the senses. You sit hot after your meal of me, plaything of the wind leveled by the shores I no longer dare to face. I fear the red wave of truly living and the plants that bid you adieu. Dare devil, I straddle your bridges, and so they may become my nature. I no longer know who comes and who goes, leaves, delirium to transform you into an unconscious game table, and the broom flowers, windows to peep out, smearing your sun all over the reverberate panes. Amelia Rosselli biography requires some explanation so that you have a context for what this work is trying to do, the urgencies that it grows out of. She was the daughter of an assassinated hero of the Italian anti-fascist resistance who spent her childhood and adolescence in exile between France, England, and the United States before settling in Rome. She became a poet, translator, musician, and musicologist. Her work of volatile synthesis of a literary tradition that stretches from the dolce stil nuovo through Rimbaud, Campana, Kafka, Joyce, and Pasternak, as well as a musical tradition running from Bach through post-Webernism and electronic music. She was born in Paris in 1930 into an ardently anti-totalitarian family. Her family was actually living in political exile. Her paternal grandmother and namesake was a secular Jewish Venetian feminist, a Republican thinker, a translator, and an author. Her mother was a brilliant English labor activist. Her father, Carlo Rosselli, was an intellectual leader and ultimately a martyr of the anti-fascist resistance. Having been convicted of facilitating the socialist Filippo Turati's flight from Italy, Carlo escaped from the penal colony of Lipari in 1929. It was from Paris that, with his brother Nello, who remained in Florence, he launched Justice and Liberty, Giustizia e Libertà, a non-Marxist resistance movement based on principles of liberal socialism. Upon the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, Carlo was among the first to mobilize an armed brigade of volunteers in the fight against Franco, articulating the importance of organizing resistance to fascism with the rallying cry, "Today in Spain, tomorrow in Italy." He was therefore identified as a prime enemy of not only Mussolini's regime, but of fascism throughout Europe. And he, along with his brother, was murdered by a French fascist terrorist group in Normandy in 1937, ostensibly upon the order of Mussolini. The news of this murder was dealt to the 7-year-old Amelia Rosselli and her younger brother by their mother as a problem of language. She was asked, "Do you know what the word assassination means?" And she recalls that they answered yes. The families of these two men were then forced into a series of moves between Switzerland, England, France, and the United States. They fled the Nazi occupation of France and the bombardments of London, finally crossing the Atlantic in 1940 through the intervention of Eleanor Roosevelt, who was then the First Lady, and helped acquire visas for them. This is an image of the family's first Christmas in America at the home of Max Ascoli, who was involved with the New School for Social Research. They eventually settled in the town of Larchmont, off the Long Island Sound, not very far, where the Mazzini Society and Association of Italian Anti-Fascists had been established. And it was here that she attended middle and high school. She attended Quaker camps in Vermont, and at the age of 13, she worked the fields at harvest time in New England to fill in for the men who were at war. These were among the most precious memories that she held to throughout her life. So though this person had spent her childhood in a French environment, and Italian continued to be the language of her home, where her grandmother read from classic authors such as Dante to the grandchildren every evening, she was educated largely in English from 1939 through her graduation from Mamaroneck High School in 1945. In 1946, the family returned to Florence, but her American high school degree wasn't recognized, so she was obliged to go to London to get a European high school degree. And she lived there alone in rented rooms. So this was a sort of second exile for her, but it's where she discovered music. She studied violin and piano, harmony and counterpoint, and was exposed to the contemporary Viennese school of composers and to Bartók. She would continue these studies when she returned to Italy, and she also worked with Boulez, Stockhausen, and Luciano Berio between the Rai Phonology Studio in Milan, the Darmstadt Summer School for New Music, and Dartington College of the Arts in England. Musicology provided a touchstone for her poetic. Given these roots and the fact that she was reading modernist classics from Baudelaire to T.S. Eliot to Campana in their original languages, it's not surprising that the poetry she eventually developed transgresses the confines of the Italian national language, as well as English. Her first poems and well over 100 others were, in fact, composed in English, and I'll play a clip of her reading one of these so you get a sense.
What work those tender, heavy, fat hands? Said the executioner, the hatchet fell down upon that bodily stripped souls fermenting in the dust. You are a stranger here, and have no place among us. We would have you off our list of potent bone, were it not that you've never belonged to it. Smell the cool, sweet fragrance of the incense burned in honor of some secret soul gone off to enjoy an hour's agony with our saintly Maker. Pray Buick sang a hatchet at the cut slitting it purple with blood. The earth is made nearly round, and fuel is burned every day of our life.
I think it's important to listen to this voice because, as you can see, it's sort of an undecidable accent, which is the case in all of the languages that she speaks. So she's really between these languages, and one of my points will be how do you translate someone who doesn't have a mother tongue? Her mother's tongue was English, but it wasn't the tongue of the fatherland that she chose to reside in. So this obviously poses lots of questions. And I was thinking about Mary Jo's comments about the temporality of Dante's poem and how to bring that into the contemporary moment. This is a contemporary poetry that strangely is riddled with archaisms everywhere. So "pray be away" is typical. So I try to retain some of that texture in my translations when possible. Pier Paolo Pasolini was the first person who presented her work to the public, and his comments were decisive for how she was represented. He called her family a family of cosmopolists, but he said that the avant-garde revival has found in this sort of stateless person from the great familial traditions of Cosmopolis, a terrain in which to explode with the fatal and marvelous fecundity of mushroom clouds in the act of their becoming forms. So although I really love that description of the mushroom cloud, and I find it absolutely accurate for what's happening in her poetry, she was very unhappy with this description of her family, and she called herself a refugee, and she rejects any sort of traditional national correlation when she says we were children of the Second World War here. The cosmopolite chooses to be so. We were not cosmopolitans, we were refugees. And yet she claimed Italy as a home, living in Rome through most of her life until her suicide in the 1990s. And she chose to compose most of her verse in Italian, although all of these English poems are a sort of parallel track as she's composing her major Italian books. Upon the death of Rocco Scotellaro, who is pictured here with Amelia when they were young in Piazza del Popolo in Rome, he was a writer and an activist, a socialist activist for labor rights in the Italian South. But this decision to write in the tongue of her murdered father and the premature, that of a prematurely dead lover, is a sort of enactment of a kind of melancholia that's coursing through her work. It's like a prohibited act of mourning to choose this tongue, and the tongue that's in some way responsible for the murder of her father as a primary language of composition. So in my translations, I've tried to show that the author who stages the displacement of one language through another makes musical a fact that's always been felt, but which has been amplified by the migrations of the last half century or so, which is to say that Italianness, like any ethnicity or nationality, is fundamentally a hybrid form or a synthesis of migrations. The best way to talk about some of the experiments and estrangements that come through this work is to give concrete examples, and all of these examples that I'll present pose problems large enough that their solutions really exceed the framework of an individual poem or even book, and they often leaked into and molded my own writing as well. But I can begin with titles. So this title that I didn't purposely translate into English before, Variazioni Belliche, which literally speaking would be translated as bellic variations. It has been translated by Lucia Re and Paul Vangelisti as war variations. Now, why did I choose bellicose variations? That's how I chose to translate it. Well, because belle also contains the larger part of the word for beauty. la bellezza, or bello. It also contains the word belly, which she used in a number of her English poems, and the word belle, which she used in her English poems. And the first long poem that she wrote was called La Libellula, which has been translated by another translator as the dragonfly. I actually used the cognate, the libellula, which is the sort of larger species under which the dragonfly falls, so as to maintain this correspondence with her first book, Variazioni Belliche, and to retain the pun on libel and libellate from libellare, which is Latin for to put in writing or convey by charter, and the word for a pamphlet or tract. So, you know, even just the title of one of these works, it actually took me a while to figure out how to render that. And I could have used bellic variations, but that wasn't true to the rhythm, which was so incredibly important to her as a musician. So, variazioni belliche, bellicose variations. It has a similar rhythm in that very important word. So as this example begins to show, a major aspect of her poetic is its polyglottism, not only across national languages, but across temporalities as well. This is a poem that I can read that's short, and I can give you a quick sense without going through a million different examples of where it was difficult to translate, of the kind of challenges it presents. So I'll just read this one in the Italian since it's short. Oddio che c'angelli e la tua porta si fracassi come un'auto che varca il roso cancello, passa la tua severa ordinanza, ma io non posso seguirti. Tu troppo ti nascondi, troppo premi il tuo pistone da pericolo. Tu non hai dolcezza, tu non distribuisci caldamente le felicità. Come un puro flauto dal becco sì sottile è la tua ostilità. Tu attiri per poi ripulsare le gioie barbare. I realize I left out an accent that she had on that last word. O God, may you chancel and your portal be smashed, like an auto that trespasses the corroded gate, passes your severe ordinance, but I cannot follow you. You hide too much, you press too much your perilous piston. Have you no sweetness? Do you not ardently distribute felicities, your hostilities like a pure flute so thinly beaked, you attract only to repel barbarian joys? So this word ciangelli is not really a word. It sounds like a Tuscan medieval word, but that doesn't really exist. So how do you render that? Well, it turns out that there's this English word, to chancel, but ciangelli also calls up cangiare, a poetic term, a kind of aulic term for change, or cambiare, and cianciare, to chatter, with reference to cancello, or gate, or augelli, a poetic term for uccelli, or birds, or angeli, angels, as well as cancellare, to erase. So I rendered it chancel. I love that it has the English and French word chance or chance inside of it, which it appears in her Italian poems as well, that it calls up canceling, so a kind of erasure, sounds a bit like angel, and then has this sort of archaic to our ears verb in it, to chancel. And there are other things that, you know, I tried to render in this poem as well, but that kind of discomforting syntax that, in a way, you might choose to edit out of a translation of Dante, but here she's deploying it in the 1950s and 1960s for a particular jarring effect of anachronism. This is an example that I won't go into, but just to sort of flash it up here for anyone who knows Italian, this has lots of archaizing or pseudo-archaizing tendencies, which I attempted to register by learning my Elizabethan kind of syntax. It actually hooked me up to a lot of strange societies for creative anachronism, where they would say things like, you don't use thou in that in that context. That's absolutely wrong. You won't get a date that way. But it also contains these departures into dialect, the Sardinian or Southern Italian tendency to end words with you rather than o, and strange truncations of words. So there are these kinds of elisions in my translation, like thy, and these, I guess I have this, and these kinds of strange pseudo-archaic spellings, and these kinds of words that have clearly been derived from Latin but have a kind of improper relationship to it. Now, at the end, Rosselli commands, trova quella parola soave, tu ritorna alla compresa favella che fa sì che l'amore resta. Find that suave word, you return to the comprehended saying that makes sure love remains. There's something much more comprehensible about that final line. And so there's a strange oscillation in her poetry between the cryptic and this desire really to speak to a public. She wanted, in fact, for the I to be public in her work. And so that poses a problem for the translator as well, because you have to figure out when it's in fact more appropriate to be semantically fluid or liscio, and to be kind of accessible in these windows, these windows of the poem that prove to be an accessible moment. Just one other example of a different kind of strangeness here would be what she called a grammar of the poor. So she inherited this kind of leftist or progressive tradition from her family and was interested in rendering a grammar of the poor. What does this mean? Well, it often feels like she's making mistakes. And that's how it was at times seen, that she was actually making mistakes. So this apparently simple poem, Cercatemi e fuoriuscite, is a strange poem because fuoriuscite is a command for a word that's always used in the passive sense for exiles. So to be exiled is essere fuoriuscito, and she's turning it into a command, which actually places one in the position of the agent who banishes. And yet it feels strangely incomplete because this word is almost always used to describe exiles, to describe victims. So I needed to find a way to render this kind of command that is incomplete somehow, that feels sort of truncated, like it doesn't have an object. And so I translated it, this is probably the 10th translation of it, seek me and banish. One other element of her poetry that I won't go into at great length is her work as a musician and musicologist, and here she's performing Mayakovsky with Carmelo Bene in Trastevere in 1962. She composed within what she called a cube form that would house an objective total language where these ruptures between linguistic systems would somehow be reconciled, because these spaces, these rhythmical spaces, would contain all the possible rhythms of all possible languages. She thought that free verse was played out, was exhausted, and that it relied on a subjective intuition or a romantic expressivity, which was bankrupt by the mid-20th century. And so she chose a geometrical constraint for her poetry in the simplest way possible. This is transcribed through a kind of monospaced font in which all lines are more or less equal in length. But she was measuring their duration as well, and she actually considered that even more important. This is a kind of structure that is emphasized by the cover art to her second book, Serie Ospedaliera, Hospital Series, which was issued in 1969. So an evenness of length and duration goes in concert with these patterns of repetition and variation which fill the cube to create a kind of climatic effect, so that it's almost a sort of ambient wash. And this geometrical constraint, she says, permitted her to compose at high speed at the typewriter, as if just to fill the cube with all of these thoughts, no matter how disjunctive, and somehow the geometrical abstraction and constraint would render them comprehensible. It's a kind of utopian notion that you can see in a lot of the utopian claims of the abstract art of the early 20th century and at this time as well. And I see it as related to the modernist obsession with the grid, with the obsession with the square in so much of the art of this moment. Okay, so I'm going to skip over this, if it'll let me. So this leads to what her first editor actually called stonature, or off-key notes, which is to say mistakes, which she refused to correct. She needed to fill all of the space in the stanza, and so she would add extra pronouns to things. So instead of just saying dopo la gioia in this following poem, she said dopo della gioia, after of the joy. Things like this, and she was asked to correct them, and she boldly refused at a very young age. And she wrote to Pasolini, as we discussed, I refused altogether to correct the off-key notes in my writing. So just to give you a sense, and I may stop here, of how this sort of climatic poetic works, and the sort of strangeness of adding syllables here and there. I'll read this poem, and when you hear after words of joy instead of after joy, you'll know why it is that I'm adding those extra syllables. After the gift of God came the rebirth. After the patience of the senses fell all the days. After the Chinese ink an elephant was reborn, joy. Afterwards of joy sank hell, after paradise the wolf in its hole. After the infinite came the merry-go-round. But the lamps fell and the beasts were refossilated, and wool was prepared and the wolf devoured. Afterwards of hunger the baby was born. Afterwards of struggle the lover wrote his verses. After the infinite fell the merry-go-round, after the blow to the head, the ink rose. Passionately protected, the Virgin wrote her verses. Moribund Christ answered her, "Don't touch me." After his verses, Christ devoured the sorrow afflicting him. Afterwards of night fell the entire brace of the world. Afterwards of hell, the son thirsting to distinguish himself was born. Afterwards of struggle, the acrid whisper of the peasant seeking water in the well too deep for her arms broke the quiet. Afterwards of air that fell delicate around her immense body, the little daughter with the devastated heart was born. The sorrow of the birds was born. Desire and the infinite that cannot be found again once lost was born. Hopeful we lurch until the ending fishes out a servile soul. And I'll stop there. Hopefully we can discuss more of these issues as an ensemble.
Wow. Amazing. What year was that poem written after?
This was in the variations section of her first book, so that was between 1960 and 1961.
Because it has these very strong echoes of Ginsberg's Howl. Do you hear those, and especially with the anaphora? And
she's definitely listening to American poetry, or rather, she's reading it. I'm not sure if she had access to it orally, because there was no Woodberry poetry room yet that was online. But yeah, she quotes Berryman and Olson and Plath. There are certain poets that she was returning to over and over. Plath and Lowell, which are not incommensurate with Olson and Berryman for her, because she's not of the American scene, she can sort of mingle all of their trajectories without it being a problem, which is the freedom of the stranger, really. So, where should we start?
where's Christina, our Virgil?
No, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about was this encounter with the dictionary. Because, the dictionary is such a great resource and temptation for the translator, and it always cracks me up when people say, "Oh, mine is a literal translation," as though we all agree on what that means. It's supposed to posit some kind of absolute equivalence that doesn't fancy anything up, that doesn't decorate or embellish. But in fact, what is a literal translation? When I was studying with Anne Carson, for her, literal is something more like faith to what's in a word and faith to what's in a metaphor, concretely speaking. If you say conillo, rabbit, and you mean that you're a coward, well, for Anne Carson, the rabbit would be very important. And so I'm just thinking that this kind of work with the dictionary allows you to achieve more of a concreteness than a more sort of a more phrase-oriented translation. So I'm just wondering how the dictionary on the one hand, plus this attempt at equivalence and a kind of legibility in contemporary American English could be married with one another, because they're sort of in contradiction with one another.
It would seem that way, except for almost any word, there are multiple definitions.
Mm-hmm.
So say you see the Italian word and you go to the dictionary and there's definition 1, definition 2, definition 3, and then you go to the English because for that word that dictionary maker has chosen to represent that thing, whether it's an abstraction or a concrete something, then you go to a thesaurus and there will be 20 perhaps words that are exactly matching that one word in the Italian, and that's a translation too.
Right.
So then you get permission again and so I was working for every word, I was working back and forth between the Italian dictionary, the English dictionary, and the English thesaurus. And so it was always fluid. But it reminded me today, I was reading on the plane here, Austerlitz by Sebald. And I came to and I was reading it. It's very difficult once you've translated something to read a translation without looking at every word and saying, oh, I wonder what that word was in the original, because that's an interesting choice. So there was something where he said, he was describing an architectural space, and he said it was severely dilapidated. And I thought, isn't that interesting? And he's quoting someone, he's quoting Austerlitz. So Sebald is saying Austerlitz said it was severely dilapidated. Now, again, if that were in one of the translations of Dante that I had encountered, I might have decided to drop that to very run down or extremely shabby, which, how do I know? But what it does is this translator throughout makes these word choices, and what she has done, to my mind, is she makes Sebald and Austerlitz seem like courtly gentlemen. That this is the way they think in terms of this language, whereas if somebody were to translate how I think, they'd use shabby or run down. And that would give a much more casual sense of the character. So, even for a word, whatever that word was, shabby, run down, dilapidated, you have all those choices, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, actually, yeah, what I meant to suggest with the dictionary is that there's something concrete there, but it opens out into a million possibilities. And if you were to follow all of those possibilities for every word, you would never come up with a string that would make sense. I mean, it might be an interesting translation project to have all of the possible definitions for each word and then sort of circle different,
But in some ways,
courses
that's what we
using
have
the
with
Italian.
200 translations of Dante, is
Right.
that the Italian never varies. And so if you have 200 translations, each of those 200 people did exactly that. They circled it differently in each different place.
Right. It's like Cano's 100,000 million poems, where they're sort of, well, you can imagine the kind of variation possible, but they maybe did that without so much consciousness.
Oh, I think that's right. But also the decisions, and we were talking about this at lunch, that you decide you're going to pitch a certain register, or you imagine who this woman is, and you didn't have the burden of having all these other translations, but you also then, as you were saying, it's kind of a great responsibility, because what you put down is now going to establish in everyone's mind, particularly people who don't speak the original language, this is what this poet was doing. This is how she wrote. So I'll turn that question to you. How did you negotiate that?
With great pain. We were talking about a particular choice that I had made to translate the word sfiorare, which means to brush against. There was an image in which the water of the Tiber River was sfiorando le donne, the brushing against the women. But I like so much this word sfiorare, which in fact I've always thought about where that must have come from, because it means to unflower. But it doesn't mean to deflower. So I wanted to retain the texture of that word, and I had translated it as to disflower the women. And someone that I respect a great deal took issue with this and said, it's not to deflower the women. I thought, well, it wasn't deflower, I said disflower, which is different. You know, but it was very much a kind of scholar versus poet debate, and I ultimately recurred to graze the women, because there was still some kind of extraction of flora involved in grazing, which is different from to graze against the women, which would have been the most, let's say, conservative and literal, in that sense that everyone uses the term literal as being, but it's, I don't know, at times I allowed myself more of liberty, and sometimes that was in the case of work that had already been translated. But since a great deal of it hasn't already been translated, then I found myself wanting to find more of a semantic equivalence as far as that is possible.
I'm very interested in this cube idea as well. Now, what you showed us wasn't like justified text, which would be a true cube. There was a
Right.
slightly irregular right margin, right? So this was just a gesture toward the cube?
Well, I tend to think that had she lived through Microsoft Word, her work would have been different. And in fact, I have to say that my whole first book is full of square poems, because I was like, well, if only she were here, then she would be doing this, you know, and it could really look like a cube, and it could really be a climate. Or why didn't she, when she wanted the square, why didn't she think about a public square? I want it to be a public square, not this abstract square. So there are all these debates going on with Amelia Rosselli in the forms of those poems, but she actually measured the lines, the first line, but it's only partly visual, so it was more oral for her. It was very important that each line occupy the same amount of time in the enunciation. And she was a marvelous reader of her work, and you can find these readings, some of them on YouTube, and she really kind of sounds like she's doing a Gregorian chant. And she performed with David Tudor in front of John Cage, one of Cage's pieces, and she broke into a Gregorian chant, and John Cage, she said, was very upset when she did this. Is that Patrick?
Is there some connection, do you think, with musical notation and this interest in very precise topology of the poems? And in connection to that, did she ever compose music to accompany any of her poems?
She didn't set her poems, and she became very interested in ethnomusicology and musicology. So she's thinking at such a level of abstraction. And the way that I think that this is informing her work most is that at Darmstadt at the time, there were all of these experiments in spatializing text and spatializing musical form. So she's really translating that into her poetry. And her whole way of thinking, she actually says that she thought in forms that were approximately cubic. So she's really in this space. And so if you think about work by Luigi Nono, that's breaking down these the testimony of victims of fascism, and sort of decomposing language and then recomposing it with the aid of tape, which of course was a new technology then. She was doing that at the Rai Studio di Fonologia with contemporary composers, and she was making sounds, shrieks and all these kinds of things, which I haven't been able to find any of these experiments, but she was working with taping the voice and then replacing language in different areas of time, let's say. There's much more to be done on this, though. We don't quite understand how it all connects. I'm working on it.
Hi, guys. Thank you. So, Jen, you were talking about how attempted solutions or solutions in the Rosselli poems led you, sort of spilled over into your other own work, right? And the cube shape. And I guess I'm wondering for both of you, so two things about translation, right? So one is sort of like long living with somebody else's language or narratives or structures, and the other is, Mary Jo, the kind of detail that you're talking about when you're reading Sebald, right? Like every word is this sort of like fraught decision, and I'm wondering what those two experiences and maybe other experiences in the process of these translation projects have done to the other things that you write, and if it changes sort of how you think about the other things that you write, or if it becomes more sort of a spectrum or something.
Well, I have had that question before. Do you think that Dante, working on the Dante, has affected your own work? And it's interesting because my answer has changed over time. I think that one is it's a matter of faith that, you know, the brain is so plastic that if you spend 6 years immersed in something, you have to have synaptic changes. It's inevitable. But I think, you know, Dante's name shows up sometimes in my poems, and sometimes by great coincidence. I did a process-based method of composition where I did an erasure of Mrs. Dalloway, where I took 50-page swaths of a 300-page edition of Mrs. Dalloway. And the idea was to take words, always going forward, never taking two words together, and make a poem. And so it's the kind of thing where language keeps emerging and gives you an opportunity. Do you want this word? Do you want this? The same way that your mind will, you know, should I use this word? So you just have it, though, on the page. It's like, yes, no, no, yes, yes, no, 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 and go for pages, no, no, no. Dante shows up. Now, how can that be? You know, but it does. So I feel like in some ways there's this kind of fated collaboration that we've now become involved in, that his work keeps, it's a veil through which I see things now. And even my students, one of them, we had workshop on Tuesday, and one had a poem, and the poem was rather atmospheric but a bit obscure in terms of what was going on. But in poems like that, you know, you try to see what the correspondences are. And so there was the mention of metal, there was the mention of mercury, there was a subterranean situation with these kind of people who were automatons and a master watching over them. So I started thinking about mining, and that maybe that's what was going on. And I knew that mercury was a part of that, because in Canto 30, with the counterfeiters, they have nephritic syndrome because they've been having gold poisoning from working with heavy metals. And so even that, like knowing that mercury was associated with mining and metals, came through the Dante. So I feel like there's a part of my mind now that contains everything, and part of that must be his patterning and the way he told that story.
Yeah, one element of that relationship is just taking on another person's entire archive. And I have visited Rosselli's personal library. I didn't have nearly enough time there, but the things that I discovered there, so you discover all of the things that they've discovered in a way. And I learned about World War II, you know, I learned about the 60s. I feel like my most authentic experience of the 60s, which I wasn't yet here, comes through this person, and it's so intimate and it's so disillusioning, and you know, it's really traumatic to see her go from the 50s, which were a relatively optimistic period, although I don't think someone whose father was murdered by fascists could ever be really, truly optimistic, but a kind of optimism into this depressive 1970s poetry in which she's trying really hard to speak to the public. So her history and her literary archive, but also in translating this work gave me permission to do something that I was always interested in. And I was just reminding Mary Jo that she wrote me a really sweet letter a zillion years ago, and when Boston Review published a couple of poems of mine, one of which was called Sonnet Macaronic. And throughout that poem, I was making a macaronic poem by using mongrel English and Italian words that had been part of my household, and also subjecting English to an Italian syntax. So it's a kind of hybrid language. So I was already interested in making a poetic strategy out of this. But between Rosselli's emphasis on this grammar of the poor and her work across languages, it gave me permission to work across solecisms that I hear in my family all the time, you know, and these weird formations that are somewhere between Yiddish and English, you know, Bronx English, and a Neapolitan Italian that's really archaic at this point. And it's been, you know, kind of infinite, so that in a way I even came to understand my being Italian American in a completely different way that doesn't have to be a kind of essentialist notion like, oh, I am umbilically connected to this. But no, it's partly constructed, and it's playful, and it's intellectual, and that's okay. I mean, there's something authentically felt about these experiences that are part of a continuum, but there's also been a real rupture there in the passage across to this part of the world. So.
In keeping with the topic of hybrid languages or hybrid literary experiences, I was thinking when you were reading your translation of the Inferno, how much you seem to privilege the contemporary idiom or the modern reader in terms of trying to make accessible to them the sense of the immediacy of the lyric moment that Dante is describing. And I guess my question is, do you think that it's important to try to create an experience of alterity in the act of translation? Should we preserve some sense of the alterity of experiencing another literary language or culture as translators? Or do you think it's more important to try to give a sense of immediacy by using contemporary idioms or how should I put it, phrasings or forms that are specific to the target culture?
Well, I think I'm very fortunate that we have all these other translations, and I might feel differently if we didn't. But I also know how difficult it is to get people to read one, how difficult it is to get people to read a poem, too, how difficult it is to get someone to read a book-length poem, 3, how difficult it is to get someone to read a book-length poem written in 1300. So the idea, you know, occasionally there have been a couple of reviews that have said, you know, well, this isn't really Dante. If you want Dante, go and read so-and-so. Well, you haven't gone and read so-and-so. And so, you know, yeah, fine, if you were one of those people, but if you were one of those people, you probably would have already, or you would have read some other one. And so this is a, I mean, it's a beginner in some way, but it's really rigorous. Even though some of that phrasing sounds like I have taken great liberties, I have not. Your naked asses are going to feel the furnace and the ice. That's Dante. I haven't changed a word. And that's a problem for me with people who don't know the original text that well, because when, there are so many things that seem like, in the Tar Pit Devils, one of them makes a trumpet of his ass. So, he, and translators often say fart, or, all kinds of translations that are Dante. He said that, we didn't. But I'm sure people who see the other liberties I've taken will look at those moments and go, oh, now she's gone way too far. But that was actually the original. So I think it's hard for a reader who doesn't know the original to know exactly how many indulgences I'm guilty of. Maybe not as many as you might think. But I do think that a lot of pressure is off because of this prior existence. But I see and it'll be interesting to see what Jennifer says, I see no advantage in a translation of maintaining Italian word order, for instance, because that doesn't seem like you're carrying over, which translation literally means to carry over. That doesn't seem like you're carrying over from one language to another. It's something in between that, where you're substituting English words, but maintaining a different language set of grammatical properties, or syntactical, and that's not, I don't think that's, it doesn't make sense to me. So I think that some people could have gone farther and still been absolutely literal in a sense. So again, yeah, the heat's off because all that exists, but you didn't have that, or didn't often.
I think there's no absolute. I know that I am drawn to translations that produce a kind of, climate of alterity, but that's because I've actually chosen mainly to work with writers who are already deforming their language. Another example being the poet Emilio Villa, who was working in the same period as Rosselli. I don't think there's an absolute answer to the question about the syntax, because on the one hand, I think that the order of perception in a poem is really important, and I think of someone like Oppen, where the images are coming in a certain order, and you would have to maintain that. That was so important to him. So at times I make the syntax more fluid, but there were certain instances in the book where it just didn't work unless the words oblique noise ended the poem, and so it was all a bunch of acrobatics to be able to land on oblique noise. I once heard Anne Carson give a talk on a Sappho fragment in which all of Kypris lifts her cup, and the whole poem is about basically filling up to bursting, and then the last word is pour. So everyone else had said, Kypris pours, blah, 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 blah. And she said, well, no, the whole poem is about the tension of that cup filling up with liquid, which obviously there would be sexual implications there too, and then releasing at the end. And she did everything she could to maintain that. So there are certain effects that you want to preserve, and you've got to sacrifice them at moments and retain them when it's possible without doing a total injustice to the semantic values of the original.
Yeah, and I just want to qualify, and there are often commentators will talk about, there are certain patterns of extended similes, for instance, in Dante, and they would say, this is very intentional. And when that was the case, I would adhere to those. But I'm talking about just a simple inversion of two words that, it's not even an image. It's just, forward going instead of going forward.
Right.
It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I have one last question. I have a question. I'm interested in the phrase you used earlier about language being a kind of veil when you described choosing words from the Virginia Woolf. And I'm wondering about, you're both working with poets from the past, and there's also, I'm wondering if there's a kind of future veil as well, or what the implications are of translation. And here I'm thinking a bit about Walter Benjamin's idea of translation as creating essentially a new language or a new mutilation of many languages, and thus contributing to kind of the evolution of language itself. And especially perhaps for Amelia, who is so concerned with the political implications and uses of language, I'm wondering how you see your methods of translation acting as metaphors and realities for a way of engaging with language that would then project us into future possibilities, both as poets as well as in the culture more generally and politically.
Write about my work as if it were only sound-based and not sense-based, and I was quite surprised. And I felt like that was, that person didn't have reading strategies to figure out what I was saying. But I think that over time, and maybe partly working on the Dante, I do want to be more clear. I also don't want to sacrifice or compromise the my own desire to make an aesthetic experience, but sometimes it means I'll try harder to find a way to make something that is an aesthetic experience that has some interesting, to my ear, sound patterning, but makes the kind of gravity unmistakable. Now, sometimes I do realize that that can just be in tone, but I can't write journalism because I don't want to, and poetry is poetry, and that's what I've chosen to do and what I like to do. So it will always be a failure for some people, but I think that I do continually try to negotiate it.
Well, that's everything in a way. I mean, for me, it's very important that this work exists inside of a community, and I've been lucky enough to live in communities of writers, even when they're small. But I've lived in ones that are really big and sprawling. But sometimes a comment can make you think, oh, so this filtered in. So at one point after I was about to leave Berkeley, and I'd already been working on this for 5 years on this translation project, but I had also been pretty much writing the poems that were in my first book. And someone said, "Thank you for making the English language bigger." And I thought, oh, she did that. And so now, it was as though I recognized that I don't know if I would have had the courage to do that without having this example of real ferocity and courage that is really there. Even I included a couple of letters to Pasolini and to her brother that were written in English. And I really learned from that. So that's a kind of community too. In fact, translation creates a relationship and this sort of private community in your head that you hope can then be translated out into a broader circle, whether it's of 3 people or what are we, 35 maybe. So thanks so much for coming.